Hey there. I'm excited to announce this to you today. This is what you've been waiting for in your spiritual quest. This is something I've wanted to do for a long time, and I'm finally ready to announce it that it's ready to go. It's the Grief to Growth Community Circle. Now, this is a sanctuary where like-minded souls are united in their journey through grief and towards personal transformation. It's more than just a place. It's a beginning. It's a commitment to growth and understanding. Here you're finding not just a community, but you're entering a circle of trust and depth. You're going to engage with interactive coursework. You'll dive into exclusive podcast episodes and partake in discussions that illuminate the path from mourning to empowerment. This is a realm where every question is honored and every individual's journey is validated. To be part of this exclusive circle, visit us at grieftogrowth.com/community or look for the chat icon at the bottom of every page on the main website. Remember that entry is a privilege because I want to ensure that every member is as dedicated and genuine as you are. You must apply to join, but the journey within is worth every step. So go ahead and join us today. Check it out, grieftogrowth.com/community, and I look forward to seeing you there.
Hi there. Welcome to Grief to Growth Podcast. Your host is Brian Smith, spiritual seeker, best-selling author, grief survivor, and life coach. Brian believes that the worst tragedies of life provide the greatest opportunity for growth. Brian says he was planted, not buried, and he is here to help you grow where you've been planted by the difficulties in life. In each episode, Brian and his guests will share what has helped them to survive and thrive. It is his sincere hope this episode helps you today.
Hey, everybody. This is Brian back with another episode of Grief to Growth. And today I've got with me R. Scott Malone. And I'm going to read a very short bio for Scott, and then we're going to get started. Scott is a longtime acupuncturist, a martial artist, and a meditation practitioner. He's especially interested and focused on the relationships between the energetics of the body, the heart, and the consciousness. And to give you more information where you can find out about Scott, for acupuncture, you can go to infinitepillar.com. That's infinite. pillar.com. For energetic tablework and consulting, go to esotericconsultant.com. And we'll cover those again at the end of the show. But with that, I want to introduce Scott Malone.
Hello, hello.
Hey, Scott. Thanks for being here today.
Yeah, I really appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, it's great to meet you. You're a fascinating guy. We met through a mutual friend of ours, Jake Samayedny, who recommended that I speak with you. And we had a short conversation, and I think you'll be really interested, or I'll just be interested in hearing your story and how you got into energetic work and what your thoughts are between the body, heart, and mind connection.
Yeah.
So how did you get into this work?
Well, I have to say, so I've been a martial artist forever. Both my parents are chiropractors. And so there was this, there's a sense of healing in the family. So I would see somebody come into the clinic bent over, and then over a series of days, I would see them, better, or weeks, I would see them standing up. And so I really thought there was something to that. There was something really interesting about that. And when I realized, my father, I would never have the last word if I was a chiropractor. So I thought, I ended up going into acupuncture, and it was interesting from a martial arts perspective. All the points that you would strike are essentially the points that you use to heal. So it's how you approach anything. You can approach it with malintent or with good intent. But really what happened is after I got back from India, my teacher said, "So what are you going to do now that you're back from India and you've had this trip?" And I said, "Well, I was thinking about, it was a Sufi retreat for a month in India, and it went to a lot of Buddhist places. Like we ended up at the Mahabodhi temple. And so there was a lot of Tibetan influence along with the speaking with the Sufi, because Pir Vilayat was very much engaged with the Tibetans. And so when I got back, I thought, well, I said, I think I may go to college and get a degree and teach Tibetan studies. And my teacher was Kurt Van Wiltz. He's got a number of books. He's since passed. But he said, because he had been in the scholastic world, and it had been pretty rough. And he said, "Have you ever thought of acupuncture?" And it was like somebody hit me in the stomach with a bag of bricks. And probably about 2 weeks later, I was enrolled. So
you just felt like that was something that you were called to?
it was just boom. All of a sudden I was like, oh my God, that's it. So.
And this, you were around college age this time?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So probably, let's say I went to India in 94.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe a little past college age.
Okay.
So, yeah. And that was actually one of the things that I remember. It was the last day of the retreat and everybody had gathered together and they were kind of, being together one last time. And I was just broken. The retreat broke me. And I was on top of this Tibetan monastery in Nepal, the Kopan monastery. And everybody is together singing. And I just remember sitting on top of the roof. And I just remember telling God, I was like, you either have to tell me what to do or you have to take me out because I can't stand it anymore. And it started raining on me. And I was like, oh, okay, all right, I get it. I'm just going inside now. But then when I got back, and I felt like it was a rejection at the time. But then when I got back, my teacher said, what are you going to do? Have you considered acupuncture? And it all came together. So,
wow.
Yeah.
So how do you train for acupuncture? Where do you go to do that?
So there's schools everywhere. I think here, I'm in Colorado now. So I think here there's, 2 in Boulder and 1 in Denver. So essentially it's, I think now they've changed it. I did 2 years of prerequisites and then I did all my time squished into 3 years. But I think now they're moving towards a 4 and 4 model.
Okay.
So it's pretty extensive. And somebody was saying, yeah, it's a little bit like going to med school in Chinese.
Yeah.
I don't think that it's probably, as far as the hard sciences go, it's a lot more on the theory and then the instruction and understanding of the points and how the whole body works in a holistic way.
Mm-hmm. So it's interesting. You said, at the opening, you said there's a relationship between the points that you strike in martial arts and the points that you, I guess, use in acupuncture.
Right. So there's so basically if you have the energetic system, and it depends on what level you're sort of fighting at. So if you're boxing is do enough damage to knock somebody out. But if you look at some of the Eastern arts, once you start working with the energetic bodies, then you can use that energetic body to attack another energetic body. So we have these meridians and lines running through us of the energy. And there's a study called dim mak, and in some dim mak you have certain times of day where the energy is in different meridians and you can attack different organs like that. But if you have enough energy, when you strike somebody, you're looking at affecting their energetic system as much or more than just a physical attack. So there's a point right here. It's pericardium 6. And pericardium 6 in the body is used to open the chest. It helps with anxiety. It helps with stress. It can also, the pericardium protects the heart. So people who have past traumas locked into the heart, the pericardium will take those hits so that the heart is protected. It's also known as the heart protector. And so when you activate the pericardium channel, one of the things you can do is release some of those past traumas that are locked into the body. But if you strike it, then it actually causes your whole meridian system to light up so that the next strikes that you do on somebody in an energetic way cause more damage. So
interesting.
Yeah.
So, explain to me the relationship between the different bodies. You mentioned the physical and the energetic. Are there other bodies, and how do they interrelate?
So I look at essentially the three centers: the lower dantian, which is the second chakra below the navel, right? And that's. And so we'll talk about just the 3 from the Taoist perspective, but I fully recognize the rest from the the Buddhist and the Hindu perspective as well. So that's going to be your physical body. And so when you're doing Qigong, the whole idea is to revitalize and build and strengthen the physical body and the energetic body so that you work optimally as a human being. From a Buddhist perspective, so the Buddhists and the Taoists have the biggest influence in Qigong, with the Confucian Qigong being kind of a distant third. So from the Buddhist perspective, you want to increase longevity so that you have a longer chance to attain enlightenment. So that's some of the impetus for that Qigong. Then you move into the heart center, and then you have Anahata. So that's the middle dantian. And this is, obviously the emotional center. And so you have your emotional body. Mm-hmm. And then up in the upper center at the ajna, or the third eye center, then you're dealing more with the mind. So those are the three main bodies. But there's also, to be honest, if you look at Ledbetter and the Theosophists, there's the causal body and the spiritual body. And I don't know that it ends. I think just your awareness of the bodies expands out. Mm-hmm. There's probably a cosmic body that's connected, but you'd have to have a cosmic consciousness to tune into it or something.
Yeah, but it's from a Western perspective, we think of our bodies like, I have a body. I have a body. Yeah. And what you're talking about is an expansion of that I have multiple bodies. And you mentioned the physical body and the energy body. So that's going to be a new concept, I think, to a lot of people.
And the thing is, it's one thing. It's one body. It's just the spectrum. Mm-hmm. And if you look at, say, energy moving at a slower rate to a finer rate, X-rays to matter, mm-hmm. High energy vibration, lower energy vibration, but it's all still the same thing. And you can't separate it out. And I think sometimes people have this idea of, they're going to work with one in opposition to another, or solely without the other. And it just doesn't work that way. I think one of the fascinating things about acupuncture, when you find somebody that works with it, a lot of acupuncture is, it's very functional medicine. My shoulder hurts. Can you fix my frozen shoulder? And that's all they want. And that's fine. Mm-hmm. Irregular cycles, migraines, all of the standard stuff that humans go through. But there's a deeper level of acupuncture when you look at 5-element theory, and the 5 elements each have emotions attached to them. So if you have, say, fire, it's joy, lack of joy. And then if you have earth, it's nourishing, the lack of being nourished, worry. And then metal is grief, which would be, say, large intestine and lung. And that's the inability to grieve or the inability to stop grieving. And then you have metal, water is fear. And then wood, lung, and liver, gallbladder is anger, resentment, frustration, unfulfilled desire. Okay. So all of these home to different organ systems. Fire is heart and small intestine. Earth is stomach, spleen, pancreas. Water is kidney, bladder. So when you have an issue physiologically, sometimes it is caused by an emotional problem in the emotional body. So if you have, somebody that lost somebody, then you might have grief, but we have a normal time span for immediate grief, for like the bright, shining, horrible grief. But after a certain time, it should sort of smooth out to a certain extent. Mm-hmm. Anger is the same way. You should be angry, and then it should pass. But when those things get stuck, when those emotions get stuck, then they can have a physiological impact. So you can have somebody who's grieving very hard and they can't reconcile, they can't get over it. And what will happen is eventually it will start to weaken their lungs and their large intestine, because the emotion of grief is the lungs and letting go is the large intestine. By the same token, you could have somebody who is a long time smoker, or they lived in like old Delhi or Beijing, and they're constantly breathing in pollution. Ultimately, what can happen is they can realize that they're sad all the time, they're grieving all the time, or they can't let any little thing go.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a two-way street. And the interesting thing about, acupuncture and working with the energetic body is that it doesn't really matter which came first.
Yeah.
If you treat the body, the emotions will release.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Hey there, something I want to tell you about today. My podcast platform, Buzzsprout, has recently made it easier for me to allow you to support me financially. Go to www.grieftogrowth.com/subscribe. That's grief2growth.com/subscribe. And once you're there, you can sign up to support me financially. Now, you can do it for as little as $3 a month, or of course, as much as you'd like. If you do that, you'll get access to bonus episodes, and you'll see those in the regular feed. They'll have a lock on them. But when you become a subscriber, you'll actually get access to your own private feed, and you'll be able to listen to the regular podcast along with the bonus podcast for the subscribers. I want to thank you for listening. I want to thank you for sharing the podcast. And I want to thank those of you who support me financially. Have a great day, and on to the episode. Yeah, that's really interesting that you said that, because as you said, it's kind of like there's I look at it's kind of operating on a feedback loop. So
yeah,
either one can affect the other. I think about grief. Obviously, my show is Grief to Growth. I deal with a lot of people in grief, so I'm glad that you said that. And I want to get back to how we can maybe use some of these techniques to help people in grief. But I also think about like depression. We're so in the West, we're so caught up on like brain chemistry causing depression.
Yeah.
And I wonder if it can go both ways, that our thoughts can cause our brain chemistry to change.
Yeah, I think absolutely. And in my experience, that's absolutely true. You can have people that are and depression is one of those kind of catch-all words. So I always ask somebody, what's your flavor of depression?
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Because because that will kind of clue me into what organ system that I need to work with.
Mm-hmm.
You just scoot that back a little bit. So, yeah, I definitely think it does, because the energetic will affect the physiology. And if you look at the chi body, right, the energetic system where all the meridians and the acupuncture points are, and that chi body is the interface between the physical body and then your higher awareness. And so, but it can go anywhere from the spectrum. When I was I trained a little bit with the Sufis in a work called the Raphaelite work, and it's a part of the Sufi healing order. And they spoke about, the physical, energetic, mental, emotional body, and then they talked about spiritual body.
Mm-hmm.
And they were saying essentially that any imbalance in any of those bodies, the buck stops at the physical body.
Mm-hmm.
So eventually, if it goes on long enough, if you have a spiritual crisis and it's unresolved, and like we were talking a little bit earlier about, people feeling like God rejected them.
Yeah.
If you have something like that and it's unresolved, eventually it will home down into the physical body. It may take 20 years, but eventually it will show up in the physical body, because how can it not? It's all one thing. It'll have to filter through,
Yeah, well, all these things, as I'm understanding it, we tend to like to want to separate them out, but they're all part of us, right? It's kind of like they're just different aspects of who we are. And I think in the West, we really focused on just what we can see and touch and feel.
Right.
And we've said this impacts this. This is the answer to everything. So if you've got a problem, take a pill, and the pill will solve your emotional problem. But I think it goes both ways. So in the case of what you do with working with the energy body, that can actually impact the physical body, and that's kind of new to a lot of people.
Yeah, and to be honest, I really do a lot more just straight energetic work versus using the needles.
Mm-hmm.
So the needles work. I mean, the needles, somebody asked me, it's funny because people go, so does that, I'll tell them something and, mention, oh yeah, and I do acupuncture, and they'll say, does that really work? And it always blows my mind. And so my response is essentially the same. And it's essentially, it's 500 years documented,
mm-hmm.
but possibly as many as 5,000 years. And people are still doing it. Trial, error, refinement, repeat,
Right.
So the needles actually work. But there was somebody who was talking. I think I was reading a book by Damo Mitchell, who writes great books on Taoist Nigong. His book is called Taoist Nigong, which is it's sort of a primer from I don't know anything about yin and yang to I'd like to do Qigong Neigong, and Neigong is a higher internal energetic practice. But he was saying in one of his books that initially what would happen when you wanted to be a healer is your teacher would give you energetic practices to do to see if you could feel the energy in your own body.
Mm-hmm.
And then he would ask you questions to see if you had realized and been able to sense the energy in your own body. And if you couldn't, then you were out, because how could you be trusted with somebody else's energetic body if you didn't even feel your own? So it's a thought that essentially needles came along because there weren't enough people who were tuned in energetically enough to do the work, that some people needed that extra stimulation with a needle into the point. Because you have to think about, what did they do before they had the metallurgy to make needles?
Right.
You know, they use these things called beyond stones, which were like very thin pointed stones where they use stone, basically kind of stone needles. And there's some question as to whether they actually penetrated or just used pressure.
Mm-hmm.
But I think after years of meditation and doing internal work and really kind of tuning into the energy, I had this thought of, well, why would I light up, one point with a needle when I could possibly light up the whole channel and just balance the whole channel? So if I'm doing acupuncture traditionally, then I look at my diagnosis, I look at the signs and symptoms, and then I pick the acupuncture meridians for my prescription, my point prescription.
Mm-hmm.
And I pick, according to my diagnosis, the medical prescription, the herbal prescription. And then we do all of that. And the way that I know that it's working is if your symptoms change.
Right.
So what I say is I'm putting these needles in, and they're going to balance your lung channel. They're going to balance your stomach channel. But I don't really know until there's a secondary response and you tell me that something got better.
Right.
So when I plug in energetically, and typically what I'll do is have somebody on the table, and I'll plug into the bottoms of their feet or their ankles, I'll feel the energy move into the patient, and they will typically feel an energetic sensation start at their feet and then move up to the top of their head, arms, legs, everything in between. So once I get a general sense of the energy in the body, then if, say, they're having trouble with anger and resentment, I'll plug into the liver channel, and they will actually feel that line go up the inside of the leg. And so my thought is, if you don't feel it, it didn't happen. So it has to be a visceral sensation, or a lot of times patients will try to say what you want to hear. Sure. Oh, well, no, I think I feel it. No, I think so. So if you say, I think, then that's a no. When you actually feel it, you feel it. So then that meridian will come up. And then once the meridians on both sides show up, then I'll ask that patient, does the left side feel equal to the right side? When they tell me yes, then I know it's balanced, because it's the patient's perception. It's not just, well, the needle says so it must be. Mm-hmm. And I actually did an experiment with that, where I did the needles. I checked somebody's energetic system. I did the needles, and it was more balanced, but it was in no way fully balanced. And it wasn't really balanced all the way to the organ. So when the two sides balance, then the organ itself will light up. And it's interesting. People go, I never knew what my liver felt like before. So they'll actually have a sense of their liver. And they'll tell me something like, well, I'll say, well, what does it feel like? Well, it feels hot and heavy. Okay, well, let me know when it feels lighter and when it's cooled down. And so when the patient tells me, okay, it feels good, it feels warm, it feels full, does everything feel balanced? Yes. Then I know, and the patient knows, that it is balanced.
Yeah. It's interesting, because we think about acupuncture, we think about needles, right? And I think people go, well, does this work? Because we want to know, how does it work? How does sticking a needle in my hand affect my liver?
Right.
What's the mechanism? How is this working? But it's all what I'm learning over the years that I've been, studying life, is that it's all energy.
Yeah.
And, it's so I talk to people that do Reiki and people that do, all different, we call it all these different things, but it's all manipulating energy.
Is.
But we have this reliance here on I got to do something physical. And I think it's interesting because when we take pills, when we trust that pills work, but we have no idea how they really work. Most of the medications we take, we do not know the mechanism. And I don't think most people know this. They think that they study and they're like, I'm going to produce this pill that's going to react. We just try things. No. It's like, take this and see what it does. Oh yeah, that one works. So then we produce more of those.
Yeah. Or they'll be using a drug for one thing and they'll go, oh, well, we noticed this beneficial side effect. So we're actually going to use it for the heart now instead of, like erectile dysfunction or whatever it is,
Yeah. So all of these things, so we have this, we question things like acupuncture, which you said, it's like, well, people have been doing it for thousands of years, and they've been continuing to do it because obviously it does work.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Hi there. I'm really excited to tell you about my latest ebook. It's 4 lessons that you can learn from the near-death experience without going through all the trouble of dying to learn them. I've been studying NDEs for several years now. I am completely convinced that not only are they 100% real, but that there's some very universal wisdom that we can get from the near-death experience. And I've distilled that down in this book into 4 short lessons. And I've also given you all the reasons why I believe that NDEs are absolutely real. So go to www.grieftogrowth.com/NDE lessons to pick it up for free. www.grieftogrowth.com/NDE lessons. I hope you enjoy it.
Well, and I think it's interesting too. I hear this sometimes where, like I like Reddit and I'm a victim of doom scrolling, occasionally. So, and you'll hear people say, oh, well, it's some crazy herbal medicine thing. And it always blows my mind because herbal medicine is the first medicine. Mm-hmm. It's the oldest medicine. And half of the things that we have as medicine now came because somebody decided to isolate some part of an herbal plant that seemed to do this thing.
Right.
So I just think I think it's interesting from a Chinese TCM, traditional Chinese medicine perspective, all medicines are toxic to the liver, just in varying degrees.
Yeah.
So to a certain extent, you have aspirin, which is relatively baby aspirin, which is relatively benign, but essentially it's still slightly toxic to the liver, all the way up to chemo, which is amazingly toxic to the liver. Right. And the reason is because they're not natural substances and the body doesn't recognize them as food. So the body recognizes herbs as food. Now it's dangerous to take a bunch of herbs that you don't really know what they do. Right. I don't think, watching Dr. Oz and saying I should take a whole bunch of this, because, it seems like a good idea, and he would probably even, he would offer some sort of idea of dosage or something. But people in the West are sort of like, well, more is better.
More is better. Yeah. And
it's just not. It's just not.
Yeah, I remember I talked to someone about homeopathy, and it's micro doses of things that are, quote, poisonous. But everything's poisonous to a certain extent. If you drink too much water, you'll die.
Yeah,
but you take
2 gallons.
Yeah, you take homeopathy, and it's like, I'm going to take this, and then you're going to I'm going to taint it, and then or tincture it, and then make it. And we go, well, that can't do anything. I need more.
Right. Well, and here's the thing: if you don't recognize the energetic body, then homeopathy is quackery.
Exactly.
But I actually was curious about homeopathy, and it's a whole nother study that I just didn't have the bandwidth to jump into. Mm-hmm. Although I have utilized it on occasion. But you look at how many people in India utilize homeopathy, how many people in Europe utilize homeopathy. There's millions and millions of people worldwide that utilize homeopathy, and it's recognized by the governments.
Yeah.
It's just in the West, if it didn't come from big pharma, well, then, and that's a whole other thing, right? Big pharma versus homeopathy versus herbal medicine,
Yeah, just to let people know who may not know what we're talking about, we're going off this thing about homeopathy. It's taking a substance and using a very, very minute portion of it. Like you dilute it with water like 10,000 times or something. And so it's really more. So again, when someone was explaining this to me, my Western mind was, well, that's not enough to do anything. But it's working on an energetic level, more like, what you're talking about. And again, with the drugs that we take that we put so much faith in, we don't know exactly how they work either. So,
well, and that's often a chemical shotgun approach to something that needs a finer touch.
Yeah.
We'll do a broad spectrum, which means we're doing a broad spectrum because we're hoping that somewhere in this, will affect what we're actually looking to fix.
Yeah.
And that's why I think it's interesting. Chinese medicine, you never diagnose herbs without a prescription, without a diagnosis. If you look at migraines or you look at headaches, there's half a dozen different kinds of headaches. If you have it across the top here, that's a stomach headache. If it's dull, your stomach is weak. If it's dull up top, your liver is weak. If it's pounding and you have a typical migraine with photophobia and all that, it's a gallbladder headache. I mean, and so you can't give the same herbal formula for all headaches.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I think, Chinese medicine, Chinese herbology, and a lot of Western herbology practitioners, it's very directed because they understand the function of the herbs and how they affect the body. Yeah,
absolutely.
But it's crazy. That stuff can't work.
Yeah. And the other thing that we talked about, with acupuncture, for example, and this energy work that you do is, like you said, the typical person might say, well, my shoulder hurts or I'm having headaches, coming in for something physical, but it can be useful for much more than that. And when I want to get back to specifically, you mentioned grief, people that are going through grief. So how can acupuncture help with somebody that's dealing with grief?
So I used to try to incorporate a lot of the sort of energetic stuff that's a little on the Qigong spiritual side into my acupuncture practice. And so I've really decided recently to kind of split those into two different websites, like you mentioned, because I think a lot of people coming in for just a physiological issue, they don't really, and because they're very sort of Western medically oriented, if I start talking to them about Qigong and energy, then they find someplace else to be. They just want a guy in a white coat to stick needles in them. And there is a thing, Western medical acupuncture, and it works. So I tend to, what I actually find is that when somebody comes in for a particular physical symptom, probably about half the time, that's not really why they came in. There's something deeper underlying it. And what it comes down to is, does the person do they want to address that deeper issue? Because, things don't happen in a vacuum, and it's usually not just one thing. There's usually a host of other things that are conspiring to cause this one symptom. So from an energetic perspective, from a straight needle acupuncture perspective, you can put needles into certain points to sort of activate the lung and the large intestine for grief and for letting go. So from a straight mechanical acupuncture perspective, it works really well. You have, right off the bone here, there's a lung 7, and then there's another point inside your arm, lung 10. These things will help clear. Large intestine 11 will help you let go of things. So that does work. But what I've found is if I plug into the patient, and basically the feel of the room changes, right? And now we start talking about people dropping into a deeper state of consciousness.
We'll get back to Grief to Growth in just a few seconds. Did you know that Brian is an author and a life coach? If you're grieving or know someone who is grieving, his book, Grief to Growth, is a best-selling, easy-to-read book that might help you or someone you know. People work with Brian as a life coach to break through barriers and live their best lives. You can find out more about Brian and what he offers at www.grieftogrowth.com, www.growth.com, or text GROWTH, GROWTH to 31996. If you'd like to support this podcast, visit www.patreon.com/grief-to-growth, www.patreon.com/GRIEF2GROWTH to make a financial contribution. And now back to Grief to Growth.
And in this deeper state of consciousness, often you will have people who have helpers. The Native American talk about spirit helpers and guides. Mm-hmm. So in that state of consciousness, that person's helpers will sometimes show up. And sometimes they're evidence to that person. Mm-hmm. I remember the first time I ran into this, I was actually in acupuncture school. And we had this big building, and the rooms were divided by sheets. So we had all these sheet walls. And I had this woman come in, and I forget what she was being treated for. I think it was her knee or something. And so I put the needles in, and the standard way is you put the needles in, you take a walk, you come back and check on the patient. And a lot of times acupuncturists will see, 2 and 3 patients in the same hour. So I took a walk, I come back, and she's got tears just streaming down her face. And I'm thinking, oh my God, I put something in, because I'm a student. I'm like, I put something in wrong. She's been in pain, and she's just been here crying for the last 15, 20 minutes. Mm-hmm. So I asked her, I was like, what's going on? Is everything okay? And she said, my mom died. And she said, and we were angry at each other when she died. And so I was laying here, and I had my eyes closed, and my mom was floating over the top of me. Mm. And so I had this conversation with my mom, and she said, honey, I'm not mad at you. I love you. How could I do anything but love you? And they're just streaming down her face. And she goes, is that normal? And I was like, yeah, absolutely. It happens all the time, but that was the first time I really got like, there's something else to this beyond the biophysiological effect. I mean, they found that, the meridian system actually lives in the fascia. So it's an actual structure in the fascia that moves faster than the nervous system.
There's a lot of talk lately about the fascia. Yeah.
So that was kind of, I've always been, interested in, meditation and meditative states and states of consciousness and awakening and all of that. And I just started, it started off, I was working on somebody, and I was, trying to light up these channels in myself. And it was really difficult. And I thought, well, maybe I'll just work on other people and get a better handle on it. And so I started lighting up the channels in other people. And then I started looking at, there's a certain level of balance that the body will go to as a constitutional base. So their energetic body and their physiological body will tend to balance first. But after a basic sense of free flow and balance in the body occurs, that's when things really start to get interesting. And that's when people start to have experiences that are beyond, I'm here for my health. And sometimes I would, and because I spend an hour, sometimes an hour and a half with a patient, in a meditative state, and while they're dropping into a meditative state, and then interesting things will start to happen. And I have one patient, and her father passed away, and I really felt his presence in the room. And she was really suffering because it was relatively recent. And so I just really sort of called him in as much more as he was already there. Whatever I could do to help his presence help her. Mm-hmm. And again, she had this sort of, and I think it was mostly unconscious, but some sort of communication with her father, and then it shifted. And it's interesting because sometimes I have a sense of who's in the room, and sometimes I don't. But the most surprising one was, I think we mentioned before, I was telling you about, the Baptist church and how that I had an issue with that as a child because they scared me. So I've never really been terribly Christian oriented until I found Thomas Merton and St. John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila, and then that sort of shifted things.
Well, can I interrupt you for a second? Talk about that, because we talked about that before we got on the air. So let people know about that, because I think that's a fascinating part of your background.
Oh, okay. I'll just finish this little bit because it was so funny to me. So I've always been, I'm like the most Asian white guy you'll ever meet, So I'm working with this patient, and I've always been drawn to, Tibetan Buddhism and the Hindu, pantheon of faces of God and all of this. And I'm sitting here with this woman, and I have this sense that Jesus is there. And I was so shocked in my mind. I went, Jesus Christ, what the hell are you doing here? And then I was like, oh, I was like, I am so sorry. I was really just kind of shocked. And he did the most Jesus thing. And he was like, oh, no, it's fine. I'm here for her, not for you. Mm-hmm. I was like, okay, apologies, carry on. Yeah. So it's just interesting because different folks show up for different people. And it doesn't have anything to do with me. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So everybody has sort of help along the way.
Yeah.
So, so we were talking about when my parents, my dad was a chiropractor. He ended up in this little town called Senatobia, Mississippi, as a chiropractor, and nobody knew what that was. Mm-hmm. And so actually one guy showed up at his office and said, hey, I'd like you to come out, and it was a farming community. I'd like you to check over my cows. And he was like, what do you mean? He's like, well, I hear you're a cow cracker. So he was like, no. And so we had to do a lot of education. And one of the ways you integrate yourself into a town is you go to the church. Mm-hmm. And so he went to the Baptist church. And once we were old enough, then my older sister and I, he would take us to the church with him and mom. And so I remember this one day, they took me to where all the kids were, and they had a picture of a boat, and there were two giraffes whose heads were sticking out, but then they had this long line of animals headed to the boat. And I remember as a kid thinking, there's no way they're all going to fit. There's just no way. It's not going to happen. So I remember thinking, I wish I could, hear what the big people are talking about. What are the adults talking about? So they finished that story and they took us back in. And I remember this guy, his face was red. It was Mississippi in the summer, no air conditioning, small one room, Baptist church. Mm. And this guy is red in the face and he's yelling. And I'm sitting down, and he starts talking about how we're all sinners and we're all going to hell. And he started talking about a pool of fire where you burn, but you never die. And as a kid, I remember thinking that the punishment didn't justify the crime. Yeah. Because I was thinking, I've stolen some cookies. Mm-hmm. I knew it was wrong, but they're cookies. So I did it. But I didn't think that it deserved burning eternally for it. So I asked my parents don't take me back because it scared me. And so my dad had always had some questions about religion. And so he went to the preacher for a private talk, and he started asking him questions. And he said, what happens, if a child dies before it's baptized? Well, that baby goes to hell. It was like, all right, well, what about all the people in far countries that don't know about Jesus or don't worship? And he's like, well, all those people are going to hell. And I think the straw that broke the camel's back is he said, well, what about all the people who lived and died before Jesus? Well, all those people are burning forever in hell. And my dad asked him one other question. The guy just kicked him out. He said, get out. Maybe if your faith was better, something like that. Mm-hmm. And so my dad started looking, and because he had questions that were not being answered. And so he came across a guy named Roy Eugene Davis. And Roy Eugene Davis was Paramahansa Yogananda's primary chief disciple in the United States. Mm-hmm. And he was initiated into Kriya Yoga by Roy Eugene Davis. And Yogananda's famous book, Autobiography of a Yogi, was it was huge. And that book changed my life. And I was a very early reader. And I remember my dad leaving, and he was saying, my books are in here. You have your books in your room, but my books are in here. So just don't mess with my books. And so, of course, I had to. And so I remember reading Autobiography of a Yogi, and I remember thinking, well, it's just true. Like as a kid, I remember thinking, this is somebody who is touched by God, and this is somebody who God is working through. And so all the stories of the saints and the miracles in that book just absolutely deeply touched me. And oddly enough, they didn't scare the crap out of me in the process. So I think that was kind of the takeoff point for me. And I was never like my heroes. Like the people that I looked up to were they ended up all being Hindu saints. So that was kind of my initial walk into the spiritual world was that sort of that Eastern path through India. And I remember I was really frustrated. And I asked my dad, I said, these people are Christian. And I was like, well, what are we? And my dad said, well, your mom and I believe this way, but you will figure it out and you'll know it when you find it. And at the time I was just super, I thought, well, that's a crap answer. Like that's the non-answer, but it was actually it was a huge, huge gift because I was never satisfied. So I just kept looking that way. There's a couple, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Go on.
There was a couple of interesting stories that I wanted to tell about my dad in practice. And he said that there was this woman came into the clinic, and he said she was white as a ghost. And he said, Miss Jones, he said, I haven't seen you in months. He said, how are you doing? She said, well, I'm fine. And he said, well, what brings you in? And she said, well, you told me to come in. And he said, what do you mean? She said, I was asleep in my bed and I opened my eyes and I could see through you, and you were standing at the foot of my bed, and you said that I needed to come in. And so here I am. So he had some interesting experiences like that. He had another patient that we used this old mimeograph to make flyers and pass them out around the town. And he said that this patient came in and he said, so what brings you in? He's like, your damn flyers. And he's like, well, was it someplace it wasn't supposed to be? And he said, no, but I was walking down the street. The same flyer blew up into my face 3 times. So I looked at it and I was like, well, I guess I need to come see this guy.
Wow.
And then I think one of the greatest stories I ever heard was he had this old farmer on his table, and he just lowered the table down, and he said he heard his death rattle and his bowels evacuated. And he said, nobody dies in my clinic. And he said, I went over and I did a toggle recoil to the atlas. And he said, and when I did it right before it happened, he said, it felt like all the hairs on my arm stood up and there was a charge in the room. And when I dropped the adjustment onto his neck, all that energy was transferred, and he coughed and woke up.
Oh, wow.
I just thought that was super, super interesting. That there is a power beyond us that can work through us.
Yeah. Yeah. Scott, I remember when we talked earlier, you were talking about your experience with the Baptist church, and I was raised in the Pentecostal church.
Sorry. Hang on one second.
So yeah, Scott, we had a little technical difficulty there, but we're back. You were talking about the Baptist church and how it affected you. And I was raised in the Pentecostal church, and it was a similar experience. I think it's interesting how some people hear these stories about, the burning in hell, and it doesn't bother them, and they can accept it, like that preacher, right? It's like, oh yeah, they're in hell. Oh, they're in hell. They're in hell.
Yeah.
I think those people don't have any concept of what it means to burn eternally. How can anybody just be so cavalier about the fact that anybody's burning eternally, and let alone the vast majority of humanity?
Yeah.
So for myself, I was kind of the same way as you. And I actually said in my Facebook profile, I'm like, I was, born a Christian, because technically I pretty much was. No one's born a Christian, but I was raised in the church. But then when I discovered Eastern religions, I was really drawn to I think there's a lot of deep truth in that. But now, it's funny. It's this while I'm going to tell you the story no one has ever heard before, but I had a reading with the medium just last week, and my grandmother came through. My grandmother was very religious and stuff. And she said, "You're doing great things. Everything you're doing is great, but don't forget where you came from. Don't forget your foundation." And it's funny you told that story about Jesus, because Jesus keeps coming up over and over again. And I interviewed a guy yesterday, Jewish guy, Orthodox Jew, had a near-death experience at the age of 3, and he said Jesus was there. And you hear when people say, "Oh, near-death experiences are just wishful thinking, it's just cultural conditioning." Well, this was a Orthodox Jew. The last person he expected to see was Jesus. So I think there's something to that. When you talked about earlier, you're in this room and Jesus shows up. I mean, I think it's pretty wild, because
I was so stunned. That's why I was thinking there's something to this, because I'm absolutely stunned. It was the last thing I expected. I had another woman, and she said that while she was on the table, Mary came to her and spoke to her.
Mm-hmm.
And I have to say, I had a pretty hard negative view of Christianity until when I was in acupuncture school. There was a woman there, and she was having her baby christened.
Mm-hmm.
Christened, baptized, I'm not sure. So we went to this church, and I know it wasn't a Catholic church, because the Catholic church, and the Eastern Orthodox, the regalia is perfect, right? It's just awe-inspiring just to be there.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was some other form of church. And I remember the guy came in, and he had a stole on, and in this really terrible 70s green, it said "Holy, Holy, Holy" on it. And I just remember thinking, this guy is like the used car salesman of preachers. Mm-hmm. And so he gave a short talk, and then he brought the baby up. And so I was still thinking, why am I wasting my Saturday here? And he brought the baby up, and there was a golden chalice that had some oil in it. And this baby is not having it. This baby is done and been done. Mm-hmm. And it's just writhing, and he's trying to wrestle this baby. And so I see him drop his 2 fingers into the oil. And then he looks up, and he holds his fingers up. And I saw this clear beam of light come from above and attach to his fingers. And then when he touched it onto the baby's forehead, the baby immediately settled, and the beam was now attached to the baby's forehead.
Wow.
And I was thinking, okay, maybe it is everywhere. It just depends on the person. It just depends on the preacher or the person. And because I had already recognized that, well, there are awake people, there are holy people in all traditions. Right. But I've been really holding out because I had such a bad experience. And this one guy, he changed all that. I was like, okay, he's to be able to do that. He's tuned into the infinite. He's tuned into the divine.
Yeah. And you're right. We can sometimes, because I think especially when we grow up in a tradition, we can see the flaws in it, and then we can become overly critical of that. And I'm coming back to, I quote the Bible to people all the time, because I was raised in that, because there's so much good stuff in the Bible. Even there's a lot of bad stuff. It was corrupted for sure. It was polluted, but there's so much good stuff in there. And, we should not throw out the baby with the bathwater. And when we hear about these experiences with Jesus, this guy, he had a beautiful quote in his book about how Jesus is basically the highest representation of what man can be. And he's always with us at all time, and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, this is what Christians should be saying about Jesus. And I
Yeah.
was never taught this in church. And this is
Yeah.
coming from a guy who's an Orthodox Jew.
Well, when you're moved, and it doesn't. And if at a certain point, if you're so stubborn that when something overwhelming presents itself to you and you still turn your face away, then you're just being an ass.
Yeah.
You're just being stubborn.
Yeah.
You know.
So we were talking earlier before we got started. You mentioned, and I want you to tell this part about the guy that was using DMT, which is it's a natural occurring substance that, to let people know before you answer, it's a naturally occurring substance, but if we take it, it kind of opens us up to other realms. So go ahead and tell us about that.
I want to find the guy's name. It was something like he wrote a book, Field of Diamonds, maybe. He's a PhD.
Mm-hmm.
I forget his name, but one of his book is something of diamonds, like Field of Diamonds or something like that. But essentially, he has a lot of things on YouTube and Vimeo. I wish I had his name for it. But he essentially did a number of tests, a number of experiments with DMT again and again and again. And I think it was DMT and not LSD, but I could be mistaken. But he essentially did this over a number of years, and he just kept going farther and farther and deeper into the experience. And he had beings that would show up and talk to him and guide him and show him what was coming and show him like the grand scheme of humanity over, a million years or something like that. And he said that he realized he just couldn't do it anymore because the pain of leaving these rarefied realms, these heavenly realms, and coming back was just too great. And he knew that he just couldn't do it anymore if he, expected to live the rest of his life. Yeah. As a human being.
Yeah. It was just fascinating when you told me that, because we were talking earlier. You said, I've interviewed so many near-death experiences, and we talked about some of the side effects of near-death experience. And one of them is a lot of times people have trouble coming back and living on this planet. So, I wonder, because people say sometimes, I wish I could have a near-death experience. I wish I could have a near-death experience. And it's difficult sometimes to integrate that experience and come back and just be a human.
Yeah.
And the thing I also wanted the connection I wanted to draw, because DMT is a plant medicine, or LSD, what the guy may have been using, or something called ayahuasca. So these plant medicines seem to open us up to other realms, but there are other ways to reach these things too.
Yeah.
Sometimes through meditation and through the experiences that you've had in this energetic thing. And my personal belief is the brain is a filter, and the brain has been evolved to just show us what's important, to show us the saber-toothed tiger that's running at us.
Yeah.
And we don't see everything that's going on around us, but if we can somehow lower that filter a little bit through some of these medicines or energetic states, we can start to open up to these different realms.
In the Taoist perspective, the filter is actually the upper chakra, the pineal gland. And it's interesting, and I'm just going to mention this. A lot of people, when they talk about the third eye center, they kind of put it forward in their head here. But it's actually, if you go a little bit back behind your earlobe diagonally, it's actually on top of the spine. So straight up from your spine up into the brain. When it moves forward towards the front, it hits the pituitary. And a lot of people try to access the third eye in the mid part of their brain, not necessarily the midbrain, but in the middle part of their brain. And that's actually the pituitary. So they're missing. It's usually farther back, but it opens up to here and then onto the sides. And I have had patients say that when it opened, it felt like there was actually a whole band of eyes around. But the upper dantian is seen as a filter, and it's a filter of all the information from all the other realms. So from the beings around us, there are some people, I know a woman named Storm, and she sees all the beings around somebody, and she's done it ever since she was a kid. And, she would be talking to, her friends, and then she'd talk to a kid that she called Bent-Neck Jimmy, and people would look at her like she was crazy, and they were like, what? And she's like, who are you talking to? And they're like, well, I'm talking to Bent-Neck Jimmy. And, come to find out he was a kid who had broken his neck in the area, 40 years before. So that's a filter. And I think there's a real sort of caution with working with the filter until the lower bodies are fully integrated, till especially the heart center and that lower energetic center are fully integrated. Because we have a tendency to want to check out and away. So if people could see, and to me, I think it's probably the danger of really advanced VR or something where people want to live in these fantasy worlds and not live here and now. But if you're not really rooted and grounded, there can be a tendency to want to live in these sort of transcendent realms. And so that filter keeps you from seeing probably all the spirits that are around and the animal spirits and who knows what else from whatever realm is around you. And drugs can, I think if the ethnogens are used in the proper context, I think if they're used in a context that's culturally proven for a spiritual reason, I think that you have, and typically those things are run by a shaman. And the medicine man in any tradition, whenever something is going on, he's the guy that protects everybody and everybody's experience. So he's the guy that sort of puts the shield up around everyone to make sure everyone's okay. So if you find yourself, with a bunch of peyote and you decide to go out into the desert and, it might be okay, but it might blow those filters open. Right. And I think that's where you have some people who are in institutions because they blew those filters open and they couldn't get back. Like if you look at Alex Gray, the guy that does all that really interesting art with the chakras and the body. Have you seen him?
I don't think so.
You'd probably recognize the picture, but he shows all the energetic bodies and he said that he did so many hallucinogens that he almost didn't make it back, and it took him years to integrate from coming back. So I just think those are they're useful in the proper context.
And there's a parallel there to the near-death experience because they get blown open and they sometimes have really trouble integrating. And almost every time I interview a near-death experiencer, they mess up the electronics. We have problems with the connection. They can't. They might wear the watch anymore, but they have to constantly buy cell phones, and the computers are always messed up.
Yeah.
And a lot of sometimes they're like, like we were saying earlier, it's like I don't know if I want to go through all the crap we have to go through here because I want to escape. So I think that filter is there for a reason, and sometimes it's maybe good to peek, get a little peek so we can, remember who we are, and when we start to get too down and too much into this. But and I want to ask this to you because this is why I say to people all the time. I think as human beings, we have to be grounded, and we have to be able to connect to this heavenly realms, and we've got to be balanced between those. We've got to figure out when I'm too far down in this and I get too caught up in the day to day. I need to be able to get to that higher perspective. Yeah. But I can't live there.
There's a great story. I love Rabbi David Cooper. He wrote a great book called God is a Verb. But he wrote another book about retreat called Silence, Simplicity, and Solitude. And he said that he was at Big Sur somewhere out in California. And he's all about retreat, 40-day retreats, because that's, it's in the Torah. And so he goes out and he does this 40-day retreat, and he's praying every day, meditating every day. He packs up all his stuff and he's coming back down from the retreat hut, and there's all this sound going on. There's all this drumming going on. And so the Rainbow People were having a thing down there. So he goes and he just joins in. He hasn't seen another human being for 40 days. So he says he sits down next to this guy on this log around a fire, and they start talking. And he said they were talking at this amazingly deep spiritual level. And he said at a certain point, he realized that the only way this guy was able to speak to him this way was because he was on mescaline. And he said it made him very sad because he realized that his experience was integrated into his body. His experience was his own, and he would not lose that. But this guy in, 6 or 8 hours was going to lose all touch with that.
Yeah.
So I think this is something that'll speak directly to your question. So when I was first working on people, I was really interested in Kundalini and the chakras. Mm-hmm. And so all the energy going up. And I've actually figured out a way energetically to basically clear the pathway so that if a person is ready, that will happen unimpaired, right? So people run into trouble when that Kundalini lets go if they have something stuck here or here in their head and the energy bangs up against it, and then there's a burning oftentimes or short circuiting that happens. So if you clear that pathway out, then when the Kundalini ignites of its own volition, then it's a straight shot out. So when I was working with this, I found the 7 chakras in the body, and then I also use a couple of, in the Sufi tradition, there are 3 heart chakras. So there's the one in the center, the one on the right is the spiritual longing, the one on the left is physical longing and love. And they're basically aspects of the same center. So when I'm working with this, I was wondering, well, what about up above? So I had a person whose crown opened up, and then they felt themselves rise up above their head to another place. And so there was another chakra or dantian above the bottom. And so what I found in doing this was I went up 4 chakras above the body, and people tend to have oftentimes a similar experience. At the 4th center above the body, there's people experience the color gold and some sort of beautiful, their ideal natural setting. And I had one guy who was a Christian who said that that was where Jesus spoke to him. And so I was thinking about these chakras up above the body, and then it occurred to me, I was like, well, this seems very imbalanced. Like, why would there be chakras above the body and not below the body? And so I had one friend of mine who's just recently passed, Brian Ernest, who helped me, a real psychonaut. He really had a facility for these states of consciousness. And we basically went up 4, and then we went through the chakras to the root, and then we went down below. And so what I've ultimately found is 7 centers above the body. And I wonder about this, like, is there 7 the number? Is there 12? Is there 100? Is there an infinite number? I think what's happening is I'm recognizing in a way that I can understand. So it doesn't mean that it's true across the board that there are 7 and people get hung up. There might be an infinite number. But at 7, it seemed to interface with infinity, whatever that means. And so when somebody goes into that 7th center up above, oftentimes they have an experience, and then there's a cascade of energy that pours down through the body. And once that cascade starts, it never stops. And then when it hits the root, then it moves down, and it will move down 7. And then somebody will have an experience down below. And then there's another cascade of energy that pours up through the descending cascade. So you have the infinite below pouring up through the body, and the infinite above pouring down through the body. And I realized that they're the same thing. And it basically becomes a pillar that moves in both directions from every place. And I call that the infinite pillar.
Interesting. Yeah, wow.
And after a certain point, what happens is those energies converge into the heart. And then what happens is they connect out into the world. And so if you just have this, I'm always transcendent, then you have nothing to do with the world. If you're very much in the body and you're very immanent, and you're really just interested in the physical world and all that, then nothing comes out into the world. What we're here to do isn't offered to the world. Right. So when we have that rooted balance into the earth, we are here, get over it and believe it. We are here, but we're also in tune with this infinite above us as well. Then we can actually ground more of that to move out into the world. And in the Chinese, they say Tian Ren Di, heaven, man, and earth. And what it means in a pithy way is man walks between heaven and earth.
Yeah.
But in a deeper way, what it means is part of our function is to be conduits for the heavenly chi to come down into the earth. When yang reaches its apex, it turns into yin. and for the earthly chi to rise into the heavens. When yin reaches its nadir, it rises to its opposite. Mm-hmm. And what I found is once that's really set and people have this really connection between heaven and earth, that often and just about every time it will converge in the heart, and they will have a sense of all of creation. Mm. And it's from here. It's a sense of love. And then people tend to start to get about doing whatever their work is.
Yeah. That's beautiful. That's beautiful. I love the way that you said that. I think that's what I've been trying to say in a very not quite as articulate way, but yeah, it's that balance that we need to have, and that energy flow between the heavens and the earth, and we have to be both at the same time. That's sometimes why it's so difficult being a human, is finding that balance and not getting so caught up in the day-to-day stuff, but also not trying to escape it, saying, well, everything's good. It doesn't matter what I do. And I know people, quote, spiritual people that say this to me, and it drives me crazy. It's like, no, you shouldn't be involved in the day-to-day stuff. Don't worry about it. It's all good. Whatever happens is supposed to happen. No, we're not here for that.
Yeah. If you're not engaged in the world, well, then really what you have is a selfish spirituality. And I think Chongyam Trungpa wrote a great book called Cutting Through Spiritual Materialism.
Yes.
Then like spirituality that's just for me, just to save me, just to end my suffering. Ultimately, it's been hijacked by your ego.
Yeah.
Find, and to me, I think that the measure of a man is the depth of his heart.
Yeah. And frankly, I think that's one of the problems with the way some people, I'm not going to say everybody, has interpreted Christianity. It's all become about individual salvation. What can I get for me? And that's where we need to have that balance between that and the Eastern, which is, it's about the collective. What can I do for the world? I'm part of it. Yeah, I'm part of a team. I'm here. I'm not here for me. I'm here for you. I'm here for everybody else. And we have to do both. We got to take care of ourselves. Yeah. And we have to take care of the world at the same time.
Oh, as a friend of mine said, he goes, because I've always been like, I'm going to do it by myself, and we're all standing on the shoulders of giants, wave after wave of humanity has, brought us to where we are, and all the spiritual teachers who have, written things. And so I was very much in that I'm going to do it alone. And my buddy goes, if we were meant to do it alone, there would be billions of us. It'd just be you. It's like, all right, fine. But I just find there's so much help. There's so many people that are just selflessly giving, that nobody would get anywhere without all of us. And I love Thich Nhat Hanh has this one, and I haven't read a bunch of his, but this one little speech that he did always touched me. And he's like, I love to do the dishes. And so he's like, a lot of people hate to do the dishes, but I love to do the dishes. And essentially while he's doing the dishes for food, he's thinking about the people that made the dishes. And he's thinking about the people that raised the food, and the people that transported the food, and the people that stored the food, and the people that put it on the shelves. And he's thinking about the whole chain of humanity that brought him to this place doing the dishes.
Yeah.
And I think that's where in the West, that Western individualism is, it's the shadow side of it, is it's all me and not us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, and I love that practice of doing the dishes, or when you eat, to think about where the food came from and the truck driver that drove it and all that stuff. That will make you humble real fast. Yeah. Look around it, pick up any object on your desk, and think about where it actually came from and what it took to bring that together. The person that created that put that out into the world. So those are great practices, and I think. I'm glad to see that people in the West are opening up to some of these ways of the East. I think we can learn, quite a bit from it. And I think as a society, we're kind of sick because of our individualism.
Yeah, I think it's true. You look at, people in Norway, and something goes on. They're like, well, we're all Norwegian.
Yeah.
The French, well, we're all French. So, and here it's like, oh, well, I'm an Irish American, and that's an Asian American, and if the Asian Americans need trouble, well, then that's their problem. And it's just not true. We're all here. And it's just the overall, we're all humans. Mm-hmm. And I just think that any tradition that advocates, that advocates violence, any tradition that advocates you turning away from somebody else, it's not really a real tradition to me. I don't know, that sort of thing. Just the constant in America, the constant barrage of violence. I just don't understand it. Like, if you're going to be violent, but don't equate it to religion, because all religions say the same thing. That golden thread, it's all the same thing.
Yeah.
And that same thing is not violence. It's love.
Yeah. We're basically all one. Well, Scott, I want to thank you for having this conversation.
Thank you so much.
Today. It's been really, really enjoyable. Anything you want to say as we're wrapping up?
No, I just, I think a little bit of silence. I think a little bit of stillness. And I think, I actually just recently discovered the centering prayer from the Catholics, and I absolutely love it. It's essentially a non-dual awareness prayer to really help, deepen that aspect of your heart. Mm-hmm. And I think that anything that we want to do, is enhanced by deepening this moral and physical compass in our body. If we're too much in the body, come into the heart. If we're too much in the head, come down into the heart. Mm-hmm. But we need all of it.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. I want to tell people again where they can reach you. So for acupuncture, it's infinitepillar.com, INFINITE pillar, PILLAR. And you described the infinite pillar earlier beautifully. So I'm glad you did describe that. And for energetic tablework and consulting, it's esotericconsultant.com. So you can reach Scott there.
And I do distance sessions, so the energetic stuff, distance sessions as well. So people want that kind of work.
There's no distance when it comes to energy healing. That's cool.
No, it's all here. I want to thank Jake again for introducing me to you.
Yeah, well, I've been trying to get Jake on the show, so this is another shout out to Jake to come on Reach the Growth. But Jake Samoyedi is a fantastic guy. I want to thank Jake for introducing us also.
Yeah.
All right, Scott, enjoy the rest of your day.
All right, thank you, brothers.
Well, I hope you enjoyed the episode. I want to make it really easy for you to reach me. So just send me a text to 31996 and simply text the word growth, GROWTH. In fact, you can right now just say, "Hey Siri," send a message to 31996. And when Siri asks you what you want to send, just say growth. You can do the same thing with OK Google. Thanks a lot. Have a wonderful day.
Thanks for listening to Grief to Growth. Brian hopes that you find this episode helpful and will come back for future episodes. Brian's best-selling book, Grief to Growth, Planted Not Buried, is a great resource for anyone who is coping with grief or knows someone who is. If you enjoy the podcast and would like to support it, there are 3 things you can do to help. The first is to share the podcast with someone that you think it will help. The second is to go to iTunes, rate, and review the episode. The third way you can support the podcast is by becoming a patron. Head over to www.patreon.com/grief2growth. That's patreon.com/grief, the number 2, growth, and sign up to make a small monthly donation. Patrons get access to exclusive bonus content and knowledge that you are helping to spread the message of grief to growth. For more about Brian and Grief to Growth, visit www.grief2growth.com.
Hi there. I hope you enjoyed this latest episode of the podcast, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. What questions came up for you? What did you like about it? What didn't you like about it? I invite you to visit us at grieftogrowth.circle.so. That's grief2growth.circle.so to continue the conversation with me and with other listeners. It's a space to sound off, to share reactions, and to go deeper into the topics from the show. I look forward to chatting more, and I hope to see you there.